I guess the prevailing attitude was go along to get along. No one wanted to take on this group. They feared repercussions, they feared reprisals. And so people would design some, cockamamie way of satisfying them. This is a course outline form that every teacher has to develop if one's going to propose a new class. Include a description of how course topics are treated to develop a knowledge and understanding of race, class, and gender issues. That's all classes. That's not sociology, it's not political science. This is physics, mathematics. I had a friend here who was teaching ornamental horticulture, and she had to explain how she was going to develop a knowledge of race, class, and gender issues in her class on succulent gardens. So this to me seemed an affront to any notion of academic freedom. I was cast, of course, as the predictable racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. If you can get students persuaded of a couple of basic ideas about the nature of reality, you can go a long way toward succeeding in a social engineering project in which you're engaged.
Welcome to the great marketplace of ideas, the American University. Here, freedom of expression, honest discussion, and academic inquiry reign supreme, and the future leaders of our world meet as equals in a forum of open debate. At least that was the idea. Problem is, the great marketplace of ideas has been reduced to just that, an idea. In reality, academia today is not a marketplace at all. It's a monopoly. But it wasn't always like this. In the late 1960s, students fought successfully for their right to dissent from the dominant thinking of the day. Fueled by anger over Vietnam, protests erupted on campuses nationwide. And even though the protests were sometimes ugly and violent, it was hard to argue with the protesters' desire for free speech on campus. The notion that students and professors should be free to share their ideas without fear of punishment is the very embodiment of what the university should be. This belief led to what was then known as the campus free speech movement. I know all about it because my parents were among those protesters, and growing up, they made sure I had the same freedom of thought that they fought for. But when I got to college, I realized that not everyone who grew up in the 60s still lived by those same ideals today. Somewhere along the way, the campus free speech movement got killed by university regulations. And policies that are supposed to be ensuring tolerance and diversity are instead being used to silence people with alternative views. Race, class, and gender issues are being used as ammunition in an all-out political war. And what's at stake is nothing less than the once great marketplace of ideas, the American University. In the 1960s, protesters fought for their right to free speech. But today, protesters are fighting to shut down other people's speech. This happens frequently whenever someone disagrees with the dominant campus thinking on matters of racial politics. Just ask Ward Connerly. For years, Ward Connerly has opposed the racial preference system of affirmative action. As a member of the Board of Regents, he was instrumental in getting racial preferences banned within the University of California. More recently, he brought the fight to Michigan, but apparently, not everyone there thought he had a right to speak. Fears for his safety required a huge security detail, and throughout his speech, he was repeatedly shouted down.
How come you're so two-faced?
It troubles me to see a black man stand in front of me and speak out against affirmative action.
It bothers you that a black man would be against your point of view. If that isn't saying
Yep, 50 years after the start of the civil rights movement, and some people on campus still believe that blacks don't have the right to think as individuals.
If you question the traditional ways of doing things, then almost immediately you're characterized as an enemy of your group. You're seen as an inauthentic black. You're not really black. You know, you're an Oreo or Aunt Jane or Uncle Tom. People in academia would expect me to support affirmative action.
Back in 1998, when racial preferences were banned at the University of California, and I was at Berkeley, I lost count of how many conversations I had with people where they quite simply assumed that I was against the ban.
A lot of white people will say, well, how dare you criticize affirmative action?
It was just assumed, especially because I'm black. People would come to my office door shaking their heads about the ban. It would never have occurred to anybody that I might have a different view.
I've applied for grants, and I've been told that the reason I didn't get those grants was that I oppose affirmative action.
There's a presumption about black students. There's a presumption that black students are homogeneous. A black student who comes into a classroom could be from Harlem, could be from Dominican Republic, could be from Brazil, could be from Africa, or it could be from an affluent elite family or a very poor one. We don't really know.
Black people are poor, and that therefore you can't expect them to make top grades and scores. Well, that's extremely unreflective. All black people have not been poor for many decades now. They never were, but the idea that black and poor are essentially the same thing is far out of date.
Lydia Broder is a former Michigan State student who comes from a mixed family.
My youngest brother is adopted from Guatemala.
I always wanted to save the whole third world. I want to adopt everybody.
We stayed in the hotel. They brought Ben to us, kind of snuck him in, literally snuck him in.
This mother had apparently had 13 babies and 6 died. She had this little child she wasn't able to feed.
You never saw a more beautiful baby in your life. I brought him home. We put him in the sink for a bath. He splashed all the water out of the sink, and that's been his personality ever since.
I declare I'm the king of the house.
Do you remember almost burning down the motorhome?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did I ever ground you for that?
No.
You're grounded.
Ain't that a surprise?
Lydia doesn't think it's fair that her 2 brothers would be treated differently under affirmative action, so she sent a letter to the school paper.
I never write to papers. I wrote a little letter to the editor for the next day's papers, like 200 words. It was itty-bitty.
She wrote an editorial specifying her experiences as the sister of 2 brothers who are different colors.
Why should they be treated differently by the schools?
Michigan State University and all our other state universities and state government are going to choose between one of them because one of them has darker skin. And yet they are raised in the same home, with the same parents, in the same town, with the same advantages and disadvantages.
You'd be hard-pressed to say that my youngest son, Benjamin, has some history of discrimination in the United States we have to make up for.
They're going to say that somehow he has been disadvantaged and needs an artificial leg up.
If anything, that's going to give my adopted brother some kind of false idea that he's oppressed somehow.
No matter what he achieves,